Everyone, this is my presentation on climate ethics. Climate change is the defining issue of our times. So this presentation will show that climate change policy must be informed primarily by ethics rather than costs and other arguments, as outlined by Donald A. Brown in his 2013 book, Climate Change Ethics, Navigating the Perfect Moral Storm, and you can see the cover right here. Climate change policy is about saving lives and livelihoods so that communities and individuals can survive. Now, both climate change mitigation and adaptation require strong ethical decisions to be made to safeguard humans. Now, we're also going to talk about cost-benefit analysis because this has been a major feature in dealing with climate change the last few decades. But we will critique cost-benefit analysis, which we call CBA, point by point. So let's start off. What are cost-benefit analyses? So this is a general phrase. It covers many different techniques, and decision makers use cost-benefit analyses to calculate if a particular program's benefits will outweigh the costs of putting it in motion. And so we do this because society has scarce resources and governments want to look responsible to taxpayers. Unfortunately, climate change is a little bit messy. It can't be put into a formula. So the question is, could we conclude that cost-benefit analyses are doing more harm than good? A critique of cost-benefit analysis. Problem number 1, ethical responsibility to all people. Now, everybody, especially emitters, have two characteristics. Number 1, their own economic self-interest, but at the same time, an obligation to do no harm to those who are vulnerable. Now, if a nation calculates cost only to its own citizens and not to the citizens of another nation, then their stance is ethically flawed. Now, there's a book called Global Ethics and Climate Change by Paul G. Harris, where he compared two different philosophies. One was communitarianism, and the other one is cosmopolitanism. So, first of all, communitarianism is basically looking out for your own self-interest. Now, there's another concept called the tragedy of the commons, where everybody has a public resource. Everybody gets in there, like on Black Friday or Boxing Day, grabs what they can, and in the end, there's not enough for everyone, and then the resource is depleted. So this is what happens in communitarianism. The opposite is cosmopolitanism. This is where the ultimate unit of concern is the individual. It's not the tribe, it's not the group, it's not the nation. It's every single individual. And secondly, this is for every human equally. No one has status above the other. And then thirdly, this special status of the individual, this is global. There's nobody whose ethnicity or religion or hobby group or anything that can be above another. So this is cosmopolitanism, where your neighbor is not just a neighbor on your street or in your nation, but your neighbor is every single living human being. The second problem is distributive justice. This is where both the benefits and the burdens of climate change need to be justly allocated to everyone involved. Now, the problem is with cost-benefit analyses, one loser is the environment, another loser is the most vulnerable, and who often have contributed less to global emissions. Now, let's say the US or China, two of the world's biggest emitters, they decide to grow their GDP, emit more. Now, some of their own citizens in various locations, they will be vulnerable and suffer more. And people of other nations who have nothing to do with this will also suffer more. So their self-interest is disregarded. Justice has not been equally distributed to them. The third problem is preference utilitarianism. Now, mainstream utilitarianism, it basically focuses on what actually makes people happy. Focuses on reality, not just on what people prefer or how they vote in the shopping center, for example. But preference utilitarianism is basically the consumers voting with their dollars. It's where the so-called invisible hand of the market rules. In mainstream utilitarianism, the most important role is the citizen. But in preference utilitarianism, the most important role is the consumer. So, with climate change, perhaps as a consumer, we would lose out if we took action. But as a citizen, we care about our future and the future of other citizens. So we put our role as a citizen as the primary status. Thus, the greater good of mainstream utilitarianism outweighs the consumer vibe of preference utilitarianism. The fourth problem with cost-benefit analyses is called willingness to pay as a measure of value. Now, I'll give you a quick example. I used to work as a realtor for 2-3 years. It was not a successful career, so I am out of it. But I remember we had a manager who would give basically weekly updates. I believe he was a great fan of Adam Smith and the invisible hand of the market, because he would always say, oh, the market is going this direction and that direction, and we don't know where the market is going, etc., etc. And I remember one thing is that the market price of any piece of property or home is based on what consumers are willing to pay. So, the market price of houses in your neighborhood is based on the last 3 months of sales, what consumers actually paid for homes, and that is the benchmark. But again, like preference utilitarianism, this willingness to pay is based on human desires. There is no normative concept or ethics involved in this. And there are many things that are basically off market. You can't put a price on them. For example, on life, there's no price that can be put on life. For example, for people in various spiritualities, their sacred objects are priceless. And the last problem is that this is limited in time and space. For example, future generations, they don't have a say. Their value is not calculated. And secondly, people in other jurisdictions, they're also not included in the calculations. So willingness to pay is very short term, and it is very selfish. Problem number 5 is human rights. Now, cost-benefit analyses, they could very well entail human rights violations. Of who? Well, for example, future generations. They're not represented at the negotiating table. And also people of faraway communities such as Inuit, where in northern Canada, the rising temperatures are 3 times as much as other parts of the world. Also, what about those small tropical islands where their villages are basically disappearing into the ocean? The sixth problem is that, it's what we call procedural justice. This means that people affected by these climate change policy decisions, they should have the right to participate in those decisions. And if somebody wants to emit greenhouse gases, then everybody who's affected should give their free, informed consent. Does this happen? No, it doesn't happen. So therefore, procedural justice has been thrown out the window. So I'm going to wrap up here. But let's make a comparison. Many years ago, slavery was made illegal. But to arrive at that point, there was an abolition movement. A movement to abolish slavery, make it illegal. And this was not based on cost-benefit analyses. Oh, the slave owner is going to gain or lose how much money. No, it was based on ethical arguments. It was based on the fact that a human life is priceless and cannot be treated like a cow or a bull or a horse and traded on the market. Now, for climate change, should we really be prioritizing cost-benefit analyses? How much is going to cost to us when we're dealing with not only human lives, but animals, creatures, trees, forests? Do these really have a price on them? Or is it that we have imposed a fake system or framework onto nature? And now, with climate change, we're paying the price for it. There was a celebrated American writer named Upton Sinclair, and he had a very insightful sentence. He said, "It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it." So perhaps our heart, our ethics are being clouded by our desire to survive and thrive economically. We have new movements like Extinction Rebellion out of the UK, and also Greta Thunberg's Fridays for Future out of Sweden. And these movements make an ethical argument against climate change. So perhaps we all should follow their lead and stop looking at climate change as something that, it's going to cost me something now. Because remember, not only may it cost our own lives and the lives of our children and grandchildren in the future, but it may also cost the lives and livelihoods of people all over the world, to whom we have a responsibility too, because they are also members of our species. And lastly, you could say we also have an ethical responsibility to every creature on the planet, to every living thing, because this is our home, the home of everything on the planet, and we need to take care of it. If we don't, then we'll be swept off. And a few million years from now, some aliens in their spacecraft may fly by and say, hey, look at that barren planet. I wonder if there ever was life on it. Thanks everybody for listening to my presentation, and I hope it gave you food for thought. Thanks a lot.